Yeah, we can start, Comrade Musa. I think we are now live.
Okay. Thank you very much, comrades, for joining us today on our series, on the Christian Institute series on macroeconomic issues. And the last one that we had was with Comrade David Masondo. It was on a Saturday. And I would like to welcome everyone into the discussion and hope that we keep the discussion going on trying to formulate alternatives to the dominant narrative of what's currently being presented on macroeconomic issues. And I'll then hand over to Comrade Tembiso to introduce our speaker for the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Musa. We are, as Musa has just mentioned, so we are essentially trying to create this platform to engage in this concerted discussion around the issues regarding our economy. And as we have been trying to say, that the COVID-19 pandemic is not the genesis of the crisis. It is just a momentary spark that essentially almost opened the tap of already an existing and already overwhelming crisis that we have, which essentially predates COVID-19, but has been more accentuated by it, and so, which is, I think, our broader framing is essentially around even the fact that even the responses to COVID-19 must not just be the responses to COVID-19 alone, but we require actually more structural transformation of the economy, because a lot of what we call the crises were actually there prior to COVID, and we're going to be continue to be worsening if we're continuing on the same path. That has always been the case, and so we have had already a session with Comrade Rob, and so we began with him, and we had also a session with Comrade Raj Ngosi on monetary policy. And so today we are having this session with Comrade Duma, who is more going to talk around the issue of fund mobilization for investment and the link between monetary and fiscal, and around how fund mobilization for investment is critical for South Africa, and then give us some ideas. And so hopefully from that, the process we will follow is that we will give Duma something between 45 minutes. And then after that, there will be firstly clarity questions if there are any. And then we will delve into the discussion. And we'd like to welcome, by the way, those who are joining as participants. And so you can just raise the questions on the Q&A. And we are also welcoming those who are on Facebook and who are joining us through either the CHI Facebook or even the South African Communist Party Facebook. We have Comrade Alex, we have Comrade Deboho, and Comrade Noktula, and Juva, and Amilka, who are going to help us to actually collate, in particular, the Facebook the comments and the questions that are arising from Facebook, and just typical ground rules. But I see that the people that are affected by the ground rules are already observing them, so which is quite good that everyone is muted. Some people have even removed their faces, and so. But the fact that everyone is muted, and so please, let's just remember to continue to do that. And then when you ask a question, then you unmute, and then you mute again after you've done. And so it is really a pleasure to have Comrade Duma. He's been almost working full time this week. And some of us, we were joking earlier with Comrade Rasikan that we have listened to him for almost all of these days. And so I was saying to Comrade Rasikan that actually maybe that is good that that we are keeping on the same person, because there's a saying that you have to repeat something repeatedly, and once you repeat it long enough, people start to believe that it's really true. And so and so these kinds of things that we are talking about are quite critical. And so I think it's important for us as well to really keep on saying them until really they change the kind, almost this locking of the imagination of our people, and also the imagination, especially of our public officials, some of them who are locked and for some reason seem not to be able to think outside of the box of orthodox. And so we are very glad to have Duma. He's an economist, and by the way, I had the pleasure to go with him last year, November. Maybe I should not say where we went, because people must start to be suspicious of us. But we went to Guangdong, which is in China, and we went to some province which has a wonderful university of economics, and we had a very wonderful session with some professors of economics there, and we're talking about the Chinese project, and essentially linking the political project, but very much to the economics and those kind of things. And so we are very glad to have Duma, and we will gonna straight give it over to Duma to take us through.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Comrade Ste. I just have to say that Ste is a very special comrade. When we were in China together, the other Africans are there to shop. Nano Ste, we went there to learn. We have a fascination with the issues relating to the Chinese economy and their model of development. That's the first thing I want to say. I just want to share a sort of a light-hearted story about our time in China. We were in this town, I think it was Changsha, where Chairman Mao is. And so we're in the hotel, and the Chinese want to give us a document. So those of you who've been to China, you'll know that everything that you're used to, Facebook, Google, it's like it shuts down when you get to China. It's called the Chinese firewall. So then they say they want to send us these documents, and we say, but comrades, we use Gmail and whatever. And it became a bit of a problem. So one morning after breakfast, we noticed that suddenly 100 emails had come through our phones, you know? We're wondering what's going on. And then we discovered later that they opened our emails so that we could get the documents, and then they shut them a week later, I mean, an hour later, so we got all our emails. But anyway, I just like to share my presentation just now. Let me just try and share my screen. Someone has disabled the screen sharing. Can you just enable it to understand? I just want to share the screen. Is it possible? Stay.
How is it now?
Okay, there it is. Yeah. Okay, I've got it. Thank you so much. So today I'm going to talk about domestic funds mobilization for an economic turnaround strategy. I will not talk about structural issues and issues of structural transformation, and Comrade Rob dealt with them very comprehensively in his first presentation in the series. So I really won't talk about that. I'll talk about broad issues of mobilization for economic turnaround strategy. And I just want to say that, as you're saying, that there's one narrative that dominates, almost I was saying that every single debate in South Africa today, it's the neoliberal or neoclassical view that dominates all the debates, structural reforms and austerity. But we've seen now that there is the central bank and the treasury are feeling the pressure. And we saw the letter by 100 economists who sent a letter to Parliament. And, you know, I think the tide is slowly turning and things have changed here. So there's a danger of a single narrative, as Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie said, in a different context. So there's other ways of looking at the economy. Keynes invented macroeconomic policy and the use of counter-cyclical tools, fiscal and monetary policies, to stimulate aggregate demand. That's what I learned when I was in university in Scotland. But after a while, you realize that Keynesian economics, it's got certain limits. And in Asia, they introduced a wider range of microeconomic policy tools that can be used to achieve macroeconomic policy objectives. So heterodox economists have brought attention to those wider range of policy tools that we can use. And then there's this new kid on the block. I don't know whether to call it a new school of thought, but it's modern monetary theory. I'm busy reading the book by Stephanie Kelton on the deficit myth. MMT economists break down the artificial separation between monetary and fiscal policy, and the central bank can finance government spending. And Reg has been drumming this and has been talking about it in South Africa for far longer than I even noticed it. Yeah. So just basically, there are three macroeconomic policy tools that can boost a country's GDP in the short term. They're interest rates, exchange rates, monetary policy, and government spending. This is just the broad tools. Obviously, there are others that the heterodox economists have brought attention to. And just talking about a vision, Malaysia Vision 2020, I like this vision. With regards to the establishment of a prosperous society, we can set many aspirational goals. This is what Mahathir Mohamad said. And he says the realistic as opposed to aspirational target is to double our real GDP every 10 years between 1990 and 2020. If we do this, our GDP should be about 8 times larger by 2020 as it was in 1990. So this just shows the scale of the ambition that many of these Asian countries had in terms of transforming their economy. The last time I looked, Malaysia had more or less achieved their amazing vision. And a vision for national growth and development. I think I've been reading about this a lot since the ANC talked about a developmental state. And generally such countries have a mobilizing vision and plan. China, Japan, South Korea. We're seeing Ethiopia. It's incredible if you follow Ethiopia. They say they're following the South Korean model with Ethiopian characteristics. And this is before Abiy Ahmed became president recently. I'm talking about the previous leadership, and they've had stunning success in terms of their economic growth and development. So they've also had the state's capacity to initiate growth and economic development. You know, they've got high rates of capital formation. In China, it resulted in unbalanced growth about 5 to 6 years ago, when investment went up to about 50%. And Xi Jinping talked about the many uns in terms of the unbalanced economy that they were having. And they've also talked about human capital upgrading. If you read about the achievements of South Korea, it is incredible. The last time I looked at South Korea, it was 90% of 20 to 24-year-olds are in tertiary education. In South Africa, the last time I looked, for Black Africans, it was 15%. And I think it's heading towards 20% now. So their tertiary education sector is about 4 times larger than ours, and we've got a similar population. So those countries in Asia that are very successful, they obviously did industrial upgrading. They moved from agriculture to industry, to services. And now, if you go to China now, they're talking about high quality development where they're focusing on high tech and green development. In terms of social security, they didn't start off with the social security net, but you will be aware that in South Korea in the mid-80s, there were massive civil unrest. It's a democratic society, and they started extending social security system in the 80s. And they set up the national health insurance system, which has played an amazing role in terms of the response to the COVID crisis. And in terms of macroeconomic policy tools, as I talked about earlier on, they used a wider range of policy tools than Keynes. They used multiple tools, differential exchange rates, that state control of finance. I just have to mention China again, is that when you see in China, I think most of what you see in China now has been probably built over the last 12 years, and most of it has been financed by the state-owned banks. There's a story around those state-owned banks, which I might tell a bit later. They use reserve requirements, they use capital controls, they use prescribed assets, they use credit quotas, and they use differential interest rates. And they have multiple targets and objectives: inflation, unemployment, the growth of the economy and sectors. And I believe that inflation targeting, one target, one tool, is primitive, and you need close coordination of monetary, fiscal, and industrial policies. And this has implications for the mandates and independence of central banks. So I just want to quickly, briefly about the South African economy over the last 3 decades. And it's very important that just look back to how we got to this crisis. Now, frequently, I'm just using the period, the post-apartheid period, because there's a certain narrative that is told, which I've never quite understand. And those of you who have read State and Social Transformation by Thabo Mbeki, it sort of summarized the view on, I haven't read it recently, but I felt when I was reading it a few years ago that they didn't quite understand what was going on in the economy. Now, so the narrative that has been sold to us is that there was macroeconomic instability and we had to stabilize the economy through gear. Now, if you look here, the second column on the left, I don't know if it's on the left or the right, inflation in 1987 was at 16.2%. By the time gear was 1996, it was 7.3%. So the inflation rate had stabilized by 1996. And what you also see there is that the debt to GDP ratio was it increased to about 48%, 49.5% in 1996. But if you look at when it started increasing from 31%, in 1989, it was due to really restrictive monetary policies by the Central Reserve Bank. As you can see, the real prime lending rate went from minus 1.9 in 1987 to a high of, I think, 8.5 in 1995. So there was this restrictive monetary policy that we had, and that was the main reason for the accumulation of the debt. The deficit to GDP ratio, and you can see there 50%, we would be so happy if our debt to GDP ratio was 50%. So there was no crisis, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of the debt to GDP ratio. The deficit to GDP ratio, these are annual figures, by 1990, annual averages, at 1993 to 7.3%, and that is the crisis that people talk about. But the point is, there was growth in the post-apartheid period from 1994 to 1996, and the deficit to GDP ratio came down to 5.1%. Now, another thing that happened during that period is that the apartheid government decided to move from a pay-as-you-go pension fund, the PIC and the GEPF, to a fully funded pension fund. So they accumulated excess assets in the PIC of about 50 billion rands to the PIC in the GEPF. It sounds like a little money now, but then in a much smaller economy, it was big money. And so the Smith Committee that was appointed by the Minister of the Treasury, they just conducted a different analysis of the budget deficit. And if we hadn't gone this route in terms of the PIC and the GPF. And what they showed that in 1991, 1992, we didn't have any deficit in terms of the deficit to GDP ratio. And in 1994, it was about 2.9%. And they also accumulated foreign exchange losses of about 14 billion rands at the South African Reserve Bank, which I think we saw on the Treasury had to cover some of those losses. So, so the narrative is that we had to stabilize the economy, but if you look at these stats in terms of the neoliberal definition of stability, the debt to GDP ratio and inflation was under control at the time. So, this is just a summary over the past 26 years, 1994 to 2019, GDP per capita, 1% a year. In 2019, it was 28% higher than in 1994. And if you listen to the budget speech by Tito Mboweni, I think in February, he said China has grown by 760% over the same period and India by 300% in per capita terms. So from 1996 to 2003, this is what I call the gear phase, where you had the slash and burn fiscal policies, and we had sky-high interest rates in response to the Asian crisis. Unemployment doubled to 8 million people from 4 million people. Then 2004 to 2008, we had the world equities and commodity boom. Our economy was growing at about 4.8% a year. We had also had expansionary monetary and fiscal policies. Interest rates dropped 650 basis points to 7% in June 2003. Now, many people tend to say it was due to the commodity boom, but if you look at the numbers, that wasn't the main reason for that. If you remember at the time, it stimulated a consumption boom. I remember the laptops and the currency was appreciating. The laptops that were incredible were very much cheaper. But anyway, so government spending was also increasing by 10% a year for 4 years. Investment went shooting up to 23.5% of GDP in 2008 from 16%. And we also saw investment after gear in terms of the state-owned enterprises. Eskom, Transnet, and so on started spending, and it stimulated private sector investments. Now, people say it was jobless growth. If you look at the numbers, Stats SA gave me a time series. We created 3.1 million jobs between March 2003 and December 2018. So the employment went up from 11.7 million to 14.8 million, and the unemployment rate fell to 28.7% from 40.6%. So that's what happens during the boom period, and we did create enough jobs to reduce the unemployment significantly. And 2009 to 2019, we've had a lost decade in terms of economic development. We failed to recover from the global financial crisis, and there have been a lot of macroeconomic policy failures. So in per capita terms, our economy has not grown at all over the past 10 years. So this is the comparison with other countries in the world. If you see, the world economy grew by 3.3% over the same period. Emerging markets grew by almost 5%, Asia 7%. So it wasn't due to the global financial crisis or anything that happened from the world economy. There was no reason for us to be growing. So it was a domestic-driven crisis. Now, I love the slogan of the SACP, which I use wherever I am, the crisis before the crisis. I'm talking about in February, before we knew about the coronavirus. I must mention that I got very sick in China at the end of October when we came back, and people are making a joke that maybe you had this coronavirus. But anyway, unemployment has increased by 4.9 million people since December 2008. We now have 10.8 million unemployed people, 44% for Black Africans, 48% for Black African females, 49% for Eastern Cape. So the latest Labour Force survey does not take into account economic devastation of the lockdown. We had a 64% poverty rate amongst Black Africans. We're the most unequal country in the world with a Gini of 0.63 for income and 0.95 for assets, according to, and then we've had 5 years of declining GDP per capita, 2 recessions in 2 years, 2018 and 2019, and we're clearly heading for a 3rd recession and in 3 years, as you saw from the GDP numbers that just came out. So we've had, over the past 2 years, before this COVID crisis, 6 out of 9 quarters of declining GDP, 7 out of 9 quarters of declining investment, despite 3 summits where huge pledges were made. So I just wanted to paint my picture of the crisis before the crisis that the SACP has always brings us attention to. So these are some of the forecasts that came out recently based on SA Tide. I forget what SA Tide stands for, it's a treasury process. And B4SA, they talked about 16 and 17% GDP contraction. And the world, is it IMF, World Bank, Treasury are talking about 7%. Most private sector economists are talking about 10%. And from the start, I forecast a 10% growth in contraction in terms of GDP. So there have been 1 million jobs lost after the global financial crisis, and the economy went down by 1.5%. Now, what we're talking about now is 6 times worse than what happened after the global financial crisis. Treasury says we might lose 1.8 million jobs, and it will, if you do the numbers, that will be 44% unemployment according to strict definition. And sorry, and then anyway, that's it. So, and you saw the figures of hunger that came out of the HSRC, that 24% of South Africans had no money to buy food, 55% in informal settlements, and 66% in townships. And I just want to talk about, I believe MMT provides a useful lens in which we can analyze our economy. So what MMT says that a country that issues its own currency, this is a monetary sovereign country, as opposed to political sovereignty. It taxes and imposes levies and fines in its own currency. It borrows on its own currency, and it has no foreign currency debt. And it does not fix its currency. It has a floating exchange rate. The second thing is that a sovereign state which issues its own currency cannot fail to meet its obligation in its own currency unless it chooses to do so. It has the policy space to pursue its macroeconomic policy objectives, the most important of which is full employment, without worrying about market action or investor responses. So the only limit to state spending is inflation or the availability of real resources that can be purchased. Obviously in South Africa, we saw with the AG report, there are also institutional limits to spending. There are also similar limits to spending because of corruption. But what they're saying is that the only limit is availability of real resources. So we come close to meeting those all four conditions. We have the unique privilege among developing countries of having 90% of our sovereign debt denominated in domestic currency. Now, what you saw here is that there was, I read a paper by Hausman, when he did a survey of all developing countries, it's quite a while ago, he said South Africa was the only one that issued the majority of its bonds in local currency. I don't know if the figure has changed since then. And we also have a floating exchange rate. So in South Africa, I believe that we must increase monetary sovereignty and not accumulate foreign currency debt. We must reduce foreign ownership of shares and bonds and SOC debts such as Eskom. Now, the latest figures for May 2020 is that we have 39% ownership of shares by foreigners on the JSE and 31.5% ownership in bonds on the bond market. And we don't know about, I don't know about the Eskom debts. They've never shown us a full schedule of who are the debt holders there. And then monetary sovereignty, it makes us be able to analyze all these emerging market crises that we've seen. So we had the first crisis in 1982, which spread to the rest of Latin America. It also spread to Africa. So 40 countries were involved in this. It was called the Third World Debt Crisis. And Mexico in 1994, East Asia in 1997, Russia in 1998, Brazil in 1999, Turkey in 2002 and in 2018, Argentina 2002 and 2018. So most of these emerging market crises, every one of them over the past 4 decades, have been due to the loss of monetary sovereignty and the accumulation of foreign currency debt. So now the proposal that I'm making in terms of domestic mobilization is that we have to restructure the SA Inc. public sector balance sheet. This is none of the, I used to argue with Mike Sachs about this quite a lot, and he was worried, this is years ago, he was worried about market reaction. And I say it's none of the business of anyone in financial markets what we choose to do with our balance sheet. I find it so amazing how people in the private sector can comment on how we will deal with our PIC. The other thing is that during the first quarter, 100 billion rands left South African bond and equity markets. Our exchange rate depreciated sharply, but this was the biggest withdrawal of equity and of finance from emerging markets. It was $100 billion from all emerging markets in history. But our exchange rate went down from 15 to 19. Our foreign exchange reserves actually increased. So the lesson from this is that if there's capital flight, we can allow the currency to depreciate or introduce capital controls to protect monetary sovereignty. You'll remember in 1998, I said we should not increase interest rates to defend the currency, the carry trade game. We did that in 1998 with disastrous results. Turkey did that in 2018 and Argentina. Argentina increased its interest rates, I think by about, it was 60, it was huge increases in interest rates that you saw in Argentina and Turkey, which have been reversed recently. So that is what we shouldn't do. If we have monetary sovereignty, we don't have to play this carry trade game. And then the IMF loan. Countries go to the IMF when they have balance of payments problems and need foreign currency. We don't have a balance of payments problem. We have got 922 billion rands of forex and gold reserves. We've got a vast balance sheet, as I'll show you later, and we cannot exhaust domestic sources of finance. The true cost of the loan must take into account depreciation of the currency. The loan that we may get from the IMF, I've been speaking to the head of the IMF in South Africa about 2-3 times. The loan is only 10% of the expected 760 billion rand budget deficit. It's a small portion of the 1 trillion rand stimulus that we need. It will not solve anything. It is only 1.4% of GDP. And as I said, it won't even be able to finance the required stimulus. Now, some people say that the IMF, what I found, I wrote an article in New Frame today, that, you know, that we could introduce, what is said is that we could have, the IMF could issue what we call SDRs. But if we did that, I did the numbers, it would be only 55 billion rands for us if we got a new allocation of SDRs based on the Ocampo proposal, 1.1% of GDP and 6% of reserves. We don't need those reserves. We've got plenty of reserves. And this is the stimulus package that was announced by the president. It had two components: above the line on budget, 260 billion, below the line off budget, 240 billion. Below the line was the loan guarantee and the UIF. The loan guarantee is no longer 200, it is 100 billion. And there are big problems in the design of the loan guarantee, and the take-up has been very slow. Just as the same as the one that was introduced by the Bank of England, which had huge problems when it was set up. And I find it quite strange that we haven't learned from this thing, because before we had our stimulus, I was following what was happening with the Bank of England, and there was a big problem with the design of this thing, because the banks in the UK were asking for surety, and later on they had to relax some of the requirements for the loans. So these are some of the measures that were in the stimulus package as announced by the president. So this is just a quick summary of what the president said in 2021 April and what is in the budget. So job creation, 100 billion. What we have now is 6.1 billion. Tax measures was 70 billion. What we have now is 44 billion, and 44 billion was tax deferrals. Grants was 50 billion, and what we have now is 41 billion. Only 25 billion was new money, and we saved 13 billion on the child support grant by changing eligibility criteria to caregivers as opposed to per child. And then we cut the social relief, the budget for the social relief of distress grants to 10.3 billion from a budgeted up to 20 billion rands. Again, playing with the eligibility criteria. Municipalities, 20 billion rand, only 7.4 is new money. Public health, 20 billion rands, only 9.2 billion, 2.9 billion is new money. And we also saw massive cuts in the budget for higher education, I think was about 10 billion, 9 or 10 billion, transport 4.6, education 2.1, and so forth and so forth. Human settlements 2.1 as well. So what we're seeing now at the bottom, the original stimulus package was 260 billion rand above the line, 5% of GDP. Now, the increase in non-expenditure is non-interest expenditure is 36 billion or 0.7% of GDP. So the austerity that has been promised is 101 billion in this emergency budget, and 230 billion rand for the following 2 years, and 260 billion rand that was announced in February. So what the government is talking about is 600 billion rand of austerity over the next 3 years. And I believe this will prolong the depression, and it is unneeded in terms of, it is unprecedented in terms of the scale of austerity. It's the biggest dose of austerity in post-apartheid history. And then let's quickly, I'm disappointed Langa is not here. Langa in the last meeting was talking about the state-owned bank. And I thought I would engage him on this thing. He feels strongly about it. Yeah. So I just did a quick look at state involvement in the financial sector. Pension and provident funds is, sorry, that figure is wrong. It's 2 trillion rands. Long-term insurance, 3 trillion rands. Collective investment scheme, 2 trillion rands. Other is 2 trillion. So the total assets in the non-bank financial sector is 9.9 trillion. If you talk about the retirement funds, the first line, public sector funds account for 40% of the 2 trillion rands of assets. Yeah, the banks have got assets of 5.9 trillion. The JSE at the end of last year had 17.4 trillion. The bond market had 3.3 trillion. So if you look at the JSE and the bond market, it's 20.7 trillion rands. It's about 4 times, is it 5 times our GDP? 4 to 5 times our GDP. So it's a huge capital market that we have. Now, if you look at the top 20 financial sector companies, I did this for a presentation at Treasury about 2 years ago. So it's a bit dated figures. The PIC owns 11%, at the time, owned 11% of SA assets, and the BE companies own 7.5%, according to my calculations. So what I'm saying is that what we could do, we could have a state bank, as Langa so passionately believes, but we also could consolidate PIC ownership into one bank, one insurer. I was talking to Reg recently that, you know, a developmental state has to have state control or influence over the financial sector. So we should be able to get involved at the banking level in terms of credit creation through bigger influence in terms of the financial sector. So we can't call ourselves a developmental sector if we don't have more. So we could also spin off some of the PIC's banking assets. This is it's quite a lot of money that they have. And I just have to mention that in 2000, all Chinese banks went bust. So what did the Chinese do? The Chinese the central bank doesn't allow them to invest directly in the bank. So they created a holding company which invested in all the state-owned banks, and they recapitalized the bank. So we could have like a holding company. People are talking about the sovereign wealth fund. So we could do that as well. So we also could have like, we should diversify ownership, cooperative banking, just like the German model. Just a little bit about the state ownership in the financial sector. So the PIC's got assets of 1 trillion, shares of 1 trillion. That's 5.4% of the JSE. It finances about 12.5% of government debt. The DFIs have got assets of almost 300 billion. It's about 5% of banking assets. So we frequently talk about these DFIs that must get involved in development. I fully support that, but they are very small as a percentage of banking assets, and we have to get more control in terms of credit creation, in terms of the whole financial sector. Just quickly about the PIC, I'm running out of time. The first time in my life I've quoted Trevor Manuel, but I really won't go into this debate too much about the PIC. But this is what they had in December 2019. They had shares of 1 trillion, government debt of 500 billion, SO's state-owned enterprise debt of 200 billion, cash of 140, and their total assets of 2.2 trillion. I did a scenario. What would that mean for I'll explain the scenario later. This is my estimate of the PIC's assets in March after the collapse of the stock exchange. I did check the numbers for the UIF. They were actually correct. So the shares, they had 947 billion, bonds 700 billion, and money markets instruments 140, property 50, unlisted 75. So they had assets of 1.9 trillion according to my estimate of what happened. But what you see here is that the UIF was more or less untouched by the collapse in share prices during the first quarter, because most of its investment is in government bonds as opposed to equity. And you might have heard that the AIDC has been campaigning for the PIC and the UIF and the GPF to move a lot of their investments away from risky shares towards safe government bonds. And I was talking to Siraj, and he was saying government bonds are more attractive right now. And by the government wanting to borrow overseas, the depriving the domestic private sector from really profitable investments in domestic bonds. So I mean, that's one of the arguments against the IMF loan. We need the financial sector to protect its returns needs to invest in government bonds here. So this is our SA Inc. balance sheet. You will have heard Mike Sachs talk about this, that we have to use the entire balance sheet when we talk about net loan debt. This was before COVID, it was about 3 trillion, and now it's going up to 3.5 trillion. Eskom is now 500 billion. When the results come out, the road accident fund, I don't know where it is right now. So net loan debt is 3.5 trillion, 77% of GDP. Eskom 500 billion. The PIC's got assets of 1.9 trillion, and we've got foreign exchange reserves of 900 billion, and we've got cash balances in the National Revenue Fund of 200 billion rands. So you might remember in his paper, Mike said we could use some of these cash balances. We could reduce the surplus in the UIF to zero. That is what his proposal was. So just by looking at those two items, you could release a few 100 billion rands into the economy. I just want to talk about the PIC assets. Let's say the majority of public sector pension funds are not fully funded like the PIC. The majority of them are not funded, pay as you go, and some of them are partially funded. If you look at the US Social Security system, the largest contributory pension fund in the retirement fund, whatever, in the world, it operates on a pay as you go basis and has accumulated a little bit of funds for the baby boomers. Now, this is the PIC has got total contributions, if you look there in 2018, 2019, of 75 billion, total revenue of 117.7, total expenditure of, sorry, this is a scenario, so let me just quickly show you. This is the scenario, I'm getting confused with my own slide, sorry. So this is the scenario where the PIC liquidates 50% of its assets. So what you see, they will have total revenue of 117 billion rands and total expenditure of 102.5 billion rands. And they will have a surplus of 15.2 billion rands. Now, the current situation on 100% of its assets is that they've got a surplus of 80 billion rands at the current. So this is what Mike Sachs was saying, that we could have a contribution holiday by employers and employees, and that is the total contributions there of 77 billion rands, 80 billion rands. That's another way we could finance the stimulus, because even after the collapse of the share price, it is fully funded, and there are so many ways in which we can raise the funding for the stimulus package. So basically, my last few slides in terms of the SA Inc. options. Number one, as I said, the sovereign state which issues its own currency cannot fail to meet its obligation in its own currency unless it chooses to. We can cut interest rates, I believe, to zero. There is no inflation threat. And as Owen Wilcox was saying, if inflation picks up, let's say in next year or whatever, we can increase interest rates and reverse it. So we've got this deficit of 760 billion rands. I believe that the SA Reserve Bank and the PIC must intervene and start financing some of this deficit to reduce the cost of capital. So they must participate in the secondary market and do this as well. You might have seen lately that the Financial Times and the Bank of International Settlements, they've published reports about how QE has gone truly global as opposed to what happened after the global financial crisis. And I think more than a dozen emerging markets have now started implementing quantitative easing. And the interesting thing that they said in that paper by the Bank for International Settlements is that what the central bank governor was saying, that if you implement QE, the currency will collapse. But what you saw in all these countries, that the currency appreciated. And the biggest appreciation was in South Africa, as opposed to other emerging markets. And they speculated about reasons why the currency appreciated soon after the announcement of QE. So it is not correct to claim that QE will inevitably result in a devaluation of the currency. So we should also get involved in terms of QE on the primary market, which is called monetary finance. And the Financial Times has been documenting this. They say that throughout the world, what has happened is that in the advanced countries, central banks have basically nationalized bond markets. And you might remember back in the day under Clinton, there was a guy who talked about the bond vigilantes who punish countries, emerging and developed countries, if they do what the bond market doesn't want. So what the Financial Times is saying, that the era of the bond vigilantes, they've been tamed and they can't punish any government for pursuing policies that they don't want. In Japan, they've got a policy of yield curve control where they determine interest rates across the yield curve and from short to long-term interest rates. So these are some of the options that we should be talking about at the Reserve Bank. And secondly, we've got 900 billion rands in foreign exchange reserves. I believe it's 8 months of imports versus the benchmark of 3 months. Why can't we release some of these reserves to fund some of our stimulus? We can recapitalize through monetary financing, the DFIs, the IDC, the Land Bank, CFA, 100 billion rand. I'm just giving that an example. Developmental windows. you get these developmental windows in many Asian countries. So the way I explain it in the South African context is, let's say we decide that gap housing is our priority. We could say that developmental window, the bank gets the money at 3% or whatever, or 2%, or 1%, and they can on-lend it to these priority sectors. So you can have developmental windows for gap housing, you can have developmental windows for tertiary education, accommodation, and you can also have direct monetary financing government spending at no cost. So as I said, we could reduce the funding in the PIC. What would this mean in practice? We could write off state debt of 500 billion rands. We could write off state-owned company debt, including Eskom debt of 200 billion rand. We could use cash of 140 billion rand to fund this fiscal stimulus and convert this cash into infrastructure assets. We could also release assets of what I said, of about half of the 840 from the PIC. Now, there's been a lot of talk, this is my second last slide, about prescribed assets. We can do it through an accord, through prescribed assets. As I said, we've got 9 trillion industry assets. We probably have to exclude collective investment schemes, unit trusts, from that because they can't really invest in productive assets, I don't think. So we say 10% of industry assets towards developmental or impact investments, maybe 500 billion rand after the drop in the share price. Now, I believe that it must not be used to finance Eskom and SA debt. I've presented this to the Banking Association and many private sector forums. And quite frankly, I think they're just scared of SAA and SAA debt. And also it's going to be used to finance government debt. I think there's no need for it to finance Eskom or SAA debt. There are other ways we can solve Eskom debt, which COSATU has proposed through the PIC, and the PIC itself has made proposals about that. So the reason why I say we can't finance Eskom debt is that these developmental investments can't be used to finance past investments that do not create a single job. So we're paying for the investments that Eskom did in the past. So we can finance primary as opposed to secondary investment that create jobs. And I use this to explain the difference between financing Eskom balance sheet as opposed to an Eskom IPP project. So if Eskom wants to invest in renewable energy or their IPP projects, then that would count in terms of a developmental investment because it would create future jobs. So what I'm trying to say here is that we have to decide with the industry, and the industry is used to these type of discussions. Comrade Rob would remember this in terms of the financial sector charter. They've already committed to previous targeted developmental investment targets, and there's no reason why they can't commit to new ones. And I've been talking to the Association of Black Securities and Investment Professionals, and they want to come up with a proposal that's going to provide a technical support to the ANC proposal. And I think we should all work on developing a technical proposal towards this issue of prescribed assets, because we've been talking about it for too long. So the way I see it, I see a sort of a developmental board on the bond exchange, where you have like a different menu of potential, and you different menu of potential investments, that people can invest in. And you, as Old Mutual Asset Management, you could say, I want that one in Gap Housing in Cape Town, Khayelitsha. I want that one in, I'm almost there, guys. And so this is what I'm trying to show finally, is that with imagination, everyone talks about imagination. We could finance a lot of the stimulus. This is before we even start printing money. So this is all I was trying to say. And I haven't even included the potential of developmental windows, the recapitalization of development finance institutions, or even monetary finance. So what I'm trying to say is that let us think imaginatively as to how we can do this. And so let's think imaginatively how we can finance this. And thank you so much. I think that's it, And then finally, the stimulus components. There's a lot of talk about, I think we should establish a dignity floor below which no South African will fall. We should have the basic income grant. There's this false binary between infrastructure versus consumption spending. But what you must remember that we must look at the net cost of this basic income grant. It's actually 500 billion rand, and this is a mistake. So if you look at, there's a Brazilian economist called Monica de Boll at the Peterson Institute. She calculated the impact of a similar scheme that has been introduced by Bolsonaro. And she said, it's a temporary scheme. And she said, if we do it permanently, it will have a positive impact on the Brazilian economy and pay back some of its cost. So if you look at the net cost, it could be 50% of the headline number. You can also claw back some of the costs where people pay back people who are employed into this thing through the tax system. And then we also obviously have to repurpose the UIF system to the German model that has become the model throughout Europe. And there are many reasons. Neil, the IEJ has done a lot of analysis about the weaknesses of the UIF. And I just believe that we have to repurpose this UIF into something that can respond to crisis. These crises in global capitalism have become more frequent. They're not black swan events. And we can, next year, it could be a commodity crisis. So the mining industry must be able to, there must be support for people who may lose their jobs in the mining industry. So we must also implement a national health insurance system, education, and we must have a Green New Deal to drive infrastructure spending and industrialization. Thank you so much. Sorry for taking up too much time. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Comrade Duma. I'm trying to, okay, there it is. Thank you, Comrade Duma. Quite an insightful talk. We're gonna give over just to see first if there are any clarity questions. I see Bongani Cooper has raised a hand. Those ones who are here on the panel list, you can just raise your hand, and then we will be able to identify you. Those who are on the participants list, please just write your questions on the Q&A, preferably, or even in the chat, and then we can be able to ask it for you. I already have some kind of a clarity question from McDonald Chikumba, and he's asking on your tertiary participation stats. So his question is, what needs to change? Is it the funding? Is it the quality of education, or is it union participation or engagement? And let me just use this opportunity as well, or maybe abuse it as a moderator, just to ask, not just to Duma, but I see there's Reg here, and I saw earlier there were, yes, there is also Comrade Neil Conman, so the economist guys, they can explain this thing more. If you can be able to explain to my 81-year-old mother in very simple terms, you know, the current narrative that is made by the Congress of Treasury and the Orthodox almost presents South Africa as the Bengu household, in which the Bengu household has a particular income that comes from the, obviously in this case, my dad being late, so it comes from my mom's pension and everything else that comes, right? So what she can spend is only obviously what she has. So, and the narrative is that the problem that we have as a country is that we have too much debt. And that is why the South African family must battle up because the income of this household called South Africa is not enough to actually make the family, you know, and so for those who are running the family. So if we can just be able to I mean, the economist companies that are here, if in very simple, not in very economic jargon, but in quite simple terms, to really just explain to us whether is this picture, does this really represent what should be a proper understanding of national economy. And so what is the basic picture of understanding the national economy vis-a-vis the economy of my household, and how I run it, and so I think in very simple terms, yeah. But there is that question, by the way, from from McDonald. Is there any other question? Oh yes, let me just follow one here. Neil is asking, Neil is asking, Duma, please unpack more slowly how you arrive at a 600 billion austerity package. I don't see any hands so far.
Yeah, comrade me.
Oh yeah, okay.
Comrade Stimber.
Yes, Comrade Rob.
Yeah, I wonder, I mean, Duma is saying, you know, he's meeting with the Banking Association, he's discussing ideas of a heterodox nature with them and da-da-da. They don't seem to be rejecting it out of hand. So, and given that the last obvious source, the rating agencies, they've played their cards and they can't be that significant players. What is, in your estimation, what is it that is holding us back? Because it looks to me like we might be heading for one of the worst crises of anybody arising from this COVID situation, and yet we might end up with one of the feeblest recovery packages of any of them, and that would be an absolute disaster. So what is it that is driving the march to austerity now in terms of institutional class power? If it's not the banks are all clamoring for an austerity package, what is it that's driving us? That's my question.
Thank you very much for the questions. I'll start with Neil's one. Neil, if you remember at the budget in February, they announced cuts of 260 billion rands. So there were two components of the cuts. It was 161 billion rands for the public sector wage bill and 100 billion rands in terms of conditional grants to provinces and local government. So that's a 260 billion rands. In the current budget, the emergency budget, they've announced immediate cuts of 101 billion rands, which are offsetting the 145 billion rands that they are claimed to be spending. So that's 370 billion rands. And then on top of that, they've announced 250 billion rands of austerity, which is 25 billion rands of tax increases, plus cuts of 230 billion rands. So what I'm saying is that in the period of 4 months, they've announced cuts of 600 billion rands, 620 billion rands. So that is what I'm talking about. Just to explain Comrade Steer's thing about the households, I didn't talk about that. Now, this thing about the debt, now, if you read the budget review, our debt to GDP ratio, the adjusted one for March 2020 before COVID, before the lockdown, was 63.5% of GDP. The net debt ratio, I think, was 58%. Now, there is no universe where that was a high number because many upper income emerging countries were at about 70% for India and 80% for India. Brazil was at 90%, Egypt at 92%, Pakistan at 72%. So many emerging markets also had a relatively high level of debt. Now, what does the IMF say in the latest financial stability report? That the average country, the global average for debt will increase by 19 percentage points. Now, the average for South Africa will increase from 63%, if I remember well, to 81.8. So it will increase by 18.3 points. So it will be exactly the same as the global average. So after this crisis is over, in a relative terms, we'll be exactly where we were compared to our peers in the rest of the world. So we will not be worse off. So you, as an investor, deciding whether to invest in Brazilian bonds or South African bonds, you're going to find that everybody is at the same level. Very few countries, except the least developed countries, will be at a lower levels. And obviously none of them are rated and none of them have bond markets. So I don't think after the end of this, anything will have changed substantially. The world will get used to higher debt to GDP ratios for every single country. And you must remember, for the rich countries, it's going up to 140%. And for developing countries, it's less than that. Yeah, I think it's about, I can't remember what they said, what the actual number for developing countries are. So that's the first thing about too much debt. The second thing is about the households. Now, the difference between a household and a company and the national economy, there are two differences. The first difference is that Bengu doesn't issue the currency. You can't just issue the currency for your household. The second reason, which Yanis Varoufakis talks about, is that there is an independence between your income and your expenditure. So when the Bengu household decides that we're not going to eat out at restaurants for the next month and we're going to save 2,000 rands, that has no impact on your household, and you end up saving 2,000 rands as the Bengu household. But as a country, if every household, this is called the paradox of thrift of kings, if every family starts cutting back 200 rands and the government starts cutting back on everything, then we have national income go down, because expenditure equals income. So what happens at the level of a country, if you cut expenditure, it impacts on your income and it increases your debt to GDP ratio. On the tertiary statistics, I was just showing them to compare. In a previous life, I used to be a diplomatic spouse in Poland. And I'll tell you, it's 40 million people, you go everywhere. And I'll go and I'll meet the mayor in every city as a spouse. And you say, how many children how many people in this town? And they'd say, well, it depends. Are the students here? When the students are here, it's 800. If the students are not here, it's 600. So the level of education in that country after communism is incredible. You have colleges, technicons, everywhere you go. So so what I'm trying to say is that I don't know what we should do, but obviously I'm just showing it for comparison, what they did to upgrade the human capital in one generation for all their people. And then on the issue of what is holding us back, Comrade Rob, I think I've got a cop-out to your answer. Let me start with the prescribed assets. I believe that if we communicate this thing properly, let's be honest, the communication from Comrade Godongwana has been shocking, because he just doesn't know, he believes in it, he doesn't know how to communicate this thing in the language that the industry understands. When I presented it was still Cass in charge of the Banking Association, it was quite a while ago, not the new leadership that has replaced him. But the point is, if you use the language that they're familiar with, I think it's something that we can solve. I just think the Alliance must put together a technical task team to work on a solid proposal in terms of, because what we are seeing now is just in generalities. And I remember, was it many years ago? Yeah, so what I'm trying to, so I just think that part of what's holding back in terms of this prescribed assets, it's the Alliance itself not agreeing on what message you want to send and not communicating it properly. And we obviously saw the finance minister saying he supports a change of Regulation 28. So I'm not sure what he meant in practice, but what I'm trying to say, I think this is one that we can win. And if you talk to them one by one, future growth, all mutual asset management, we know some of these people. So I just believe that we have to have a proper communication strategy, perhaps a different spokesperson to sell this to the industry, and we can do it, I believe, quite quickly. That's the easy part of it. Yeah. In terms of the other elements, I'm not sure what is holding us back, but I do believe that there's been a lot of pressure. Neil can talk about this in terms of the letters that are going out, and I believe that the central bank is feeling the heat. They're responding to what people are saying. And the Treasury is feeling the heat as well. So I just think that there's popular pressure. I think it's unprecedented right now. And, like, the last thing I'll talk about is, the UIF surplus And from way back 3 years ago, Niva Makhetla was arguing that, was showing us about the size of the surplus, and people started talking about what are the reasons for accumulating the surplus. And they couldn't come up with a reason to accumulate such a large surplus because they couldn't have a counter narrative as to why we should have the surplus. And eventually at NEDLAC, everybody agreed, because business was saying yes, labor was saying yes, that we're going to release 40 billion rands towards the TERS benefits. So I think at some point, what you see is that they can't give you reasons why it shouldn't be the other way. So I think gradually, slowly by slowly, the central bank government said, no, we can't do QE because we're not at zero. Then we showed him that there's the 15 emerging markets that have positive interest rates. Indonesia, the largest of them, has got a higher policy rate than us. And then he says, no, we don't have an international reserve currency. And then the Bank of International Settlements showed that there's about 15 emerging markets that don't have reserve currencies, that are doing quantitative easing. Their currencies did not collapse, their currencies appreciated. So I just think there's a pressure within the alliance. Let's just focus on one thing for now. Let's try and get this prescribed assets debate sorted out. Thank you.
Thank you, Duma. So we are now open for the discussion. I have so far I have Bongani Kupe. I also have Amelka Patlane. Anyone else? I have Neil. So for them, we're gonna start with Bongani. Then we're gonna go to Amelka. Then we're gonna go to Neil. I see there is also yes, so it is those three. Unless there's someone else also who wants to take a bite at it before I give over to Bongani, Amelka, and Neil. Anyone? Okay. So Bongani, Amelka, and then Neil. Bongani.
Thank you, Ste. Firstly, I mean, thanks, Duma, for such an interesting presentation. But I think for me, just to come back to what Ste was talking about, I think there's a macro side and there's a micro side. I'm not sure whether, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, there's a macro side and there's a micro side. That for me, I think when you listen to a lot of economists in this country, they talk to the macro side, not the micro side. You can, if you had the ages report at the micro level, there's nothing happening basically. But the second part to me that really puzzles me is that if you look at all the countries that you've talked to, in fact, developed countries, they have a very skewed relationship between formal and informal sector. If you look at the South African economy, we've got a very high informal sector and a very low formal sector. And you can see COVID has begun to raise questions around how do you necessarily help someone who is in the informal sector. I think we need, as part of this debate, begin to say, how do you penetrate to, is it correct for us to continuously have a very bloated informal sector and where we cannot be able to reach that? But the third important thing that I thought for me is important, if you follow the formal and the informal, is the whole issue of the development model. I mean, the development model in the South African context has never looked at bringing the marginal people into the center of development. I mean, before apartheid, it was only white. After 1994, it included some of the privileged Black people to be part of it. And the whole debate centers around how do you bring the marginal? I mean, there's township economy. I'm saying you can't, I mean, say it's township. You need to be able to bring every development into this, people that have been the margins into the center of development. The last part that I wanted to talk about is to say, I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of liquid industries. I mean, at a micro level, taxi industry is one of them. I mean, they literally run 80% of public transport in this country, just from a numbers game. If you look at how much on a daily basis cash they carry. The second part area is the church. Churches every week, I mean, they collect money, but they still remain informal. The third, and I think the most important one, has been also unions. I think the unions sit with a lot of cash, but because of the way they are structured, that cash does not find its way to where it can be able to be used effectively to grow this economy. But the last one for me, when you talked about DFIs, I mean, I've been interacting with CIFA. CIFA outsources almost 100% of what they're supposed to do. They don't have systems, they don't have, so I'm saying at a macro level, you might be able to have this stimulus package that is supposed to have an impact. But at a micro level, if you don't have systems in place to be able to deal with that, I think we might have a problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Bongani. Amilcar? Amilcar? Okay, so there seems to be a problem with Amilcar. Maybe let's go, then we'll come back to Amilcar. Let's go to Neil.
Thanks, comrades. In relation to the question which Comrade Rob posed, which is how to explain this stampede in the direction of austerity, I think we have to acknowledge that we're in an extreme crisis situation. And, you know, if we go back to Naomi Klein's analysis of the shock doctrine, where she looked at how the Chicago boys, the economists, intervened in Latin America in a crisis and organized to impose neoliberalism in the absence of another coherent alternative. I think we're seeing something similar here, where the most reactionary elements in society, together with technocrats in National Treasury, et cetera, are imposing an agenda which is a very short-term and reactionary agenda, which is not necessarily representing the interests of business. It's not in the interest, you know, if we follow Duma's analysis, what we're seeing here is a plunge into disaster capitalism in which you're destroying large swathes of the economy, in which unemployment is going to rise to 50% or above, in which, in Comrade Duma's words, makes a society unviable. Now, why would business as a whole support an agenda like that? Business itself doesn't have a coherent alternative, but the progressive forces, although we are trying to mobilize, haven't advanced an alternative effectively enough to get a buy-in from key elements of the state as well as from business. So in this situation, it's these elements that are taking the initiative to impose this, as I said, this form of disaster capitalism on society. As Comrade Duma said, is if you, as a state, you shrink the level of expenditure, particularly in the context where the private sector is collapsing or imploding, development has to come from the state, basically, from the stimulus, from the public sector. And therefore, the proposal from Treasury to move towards a balanced budget, you know, Comrade Chair, you spoke about the idea of a household balancing its budget. They're saying we're going to move towards a balanced budget within 2 years, which effectively means that we don't spend more than we get in revenue. It's a complete lunatic idea, because basically what it means is this few $100 billion that you're slashing in state expenditure, the cutbacks, the austerity that Duma is talking about, takes away from your GDP and massively reduces the size of your economy. So yeah, I think that speaks to the irrationality of the agenda which Comrade Tito presented in Parliament the other day, but it doesn't fully explain why it is that the rest of cabinet, the presidency, et cetera, is accepting this, except to say that it's only this, these most reactionary forces that have organized themselves in this period, and that another more powerful alternative hasn't been advanced at this point.
Thank you, Neil. America, is it still working now?
I think you can hear me now.
Yes.
Yes, Comrade Director and panelists. Comrade Gqubule, my question is very simple. I'm a scholar of precariousness as a sociology student. So I'm more interested in to understand, like, in an attempt to crucially curtail government spending in an effort to control public sector debt, what does it actually mean for South Africa in a projected long term? Put simply, I'm just trying to say, do you foresee worsening crisis or a total recovery, or what one might call going back to a normal situation?
Okay, thank you. So maybe let's give over to Duma to just respond to those.
I'm sharing a screen. Can you see it?
Yes.
So, Bomani, this is the latest. Informal sector is 17.8%. My understanding is that that is low. I'm not an expert. I haven't followed this thing. There are other comrades who deal with informality and precariousness that America talks about. But my understanding is that our informal sector is much smaller than other emerging markets, developed countries like India and so forth. So some people have used it to explain why we have such a high unemployment rate, because in other countries, people are working in informal agriculture and there's larger informal sectors. So I'm not sure about, so I do think that, I'm not sure, so Kate Phillips has done a lot of work about how concentration in the economy creates lack of opportunities for informal sector employment. So every single industry has become, what do you call it, concentrated at top 3, top 4, top 5 in many of these sectors, which limits opportunities for informal employment. So I don't know, I haven't really followed that issue. In terms of the churches, yes, there's a formal church sector. My father was a bishop in the Methodist Church, and so I know all the church leaders. You know, before they went to the president, they came to me and asked me to talk about, can I talk to them about the church economy? But they wanted to be explained that there's a formal sector, like the Methodist Church where my father was. They pay taxes, they pay pensions, very generous pension, medical aid. It's a proper church. But then there's the problem is that the debate around the churches became Bushiri tied everyone with the same brush. This is my family background, there are responsible churches out there, and they by no means the Bushiris are them. But you're right, there is an informal church industry, and I'm not sure how we can measure that side. In terms of the unions, I think people overestimate the amount of capital that is in the union pension funds. I once did back in the day a study on the union investment companies. And Musa can talk to this as well. Maybe he can add to this. Besides SACTU Investment Company and MIC, they accounted at the time for, I think, 90% of trade union investment company assets. SACTU, it's clothing textile workers industry, and mining investment company. But if you look at SACTU now, Musa will tell you, it has suffered so much from the lockdown because all their investments right now are in HCI, which is invested in casinos, Tokosan, and all of that. So they're teetering on the verge of business rescue if the lockdown had continued for much longer. So I do think that the amount of capital at the hands of unions is overstated. CIFA, it's a project of mine from year to year. I just try to look at the complete lack of funding for small enterprise. CIFA is about R1 billion a year. The Land Bank lends mostly to large businesses, very little towards emerging farmers. Before COVID, I had a little bit of an exchange with them. Give me your numbers for emerging businesses. What they do, they consolidate everything under BE level 4 or something like that. So it's got nothing to do with the black ownership or the people they're supposed to target. So they don't provide funding. And then if you look at the banks, I asked First Rand, how much do you lend? And they lend 2.4 billion to small enterprises. Nedbank, they sent me an answer. From what I could see, a very complicated response. The increase in the past year, in 2018, was about 500 million. So what I'm trying to say is that there is too little funding for small enterprises. And when I was in China with the Comrade Bank, the People's Bank of China, they introduced, because the country is focused with, it's dominated by large state-owned companies, they've got facilities for small business from the People's Bank of China. England has got the funding for lending scheme, which Reg can talk about. Australia's got it. The European Central Bank have got direct windows for small enterprises. But I just think that we have to really create far more windows and instruments for the expansion of small business. And I haven't followed the debate recently around microfinance, but I remember many years ago, I had supper with the Minister of Social Development of Ethiopia. And he was saying that they've got a huge microfinance sector, which has got more than a few million beneficiaries in terms of the scale of the microfinance sector. But I don't know, there's a counter argument that microfinance by other people are saying it's exploitation of poor people, but I haven't really followed those debates lately. But yes, I'm not sure what the answer is for the informal sector. In terms of Neil's question, why does business support these policies that are against their interests? I just want to, Neil, there's this paper by Michael Kalecki, I don't know how to say it, the Polish economist. Am I sharing the screen? Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
the political aspects of full employment. So what he says, under a laissez-faire system, the level of employment depends to a great extent on the so-called state of confidence, business confidence. If this deteriorates, private investment declines, which results in a fall of output and employment, both directly and through secondary effects, and so on. This gives the capitalists a powerful indirect control over government policy. Everything that may shake the state of confidence must be carefully avoided. The mining charter, all these things that they talk about, because it would cause an economic crisis. But once the government learns the trick of increasing employment by its own purchases, this powerful controlling device loses its effectiveness. Hence, budget deficits necessary to carry out government interventions must be regarded as perilous. The social function of the doctrine of sound finance is to make the level of employment dependent on the state of confidence. So this gives them bargaining power in their debates over government. I don't know, Neil, what the answer to that is, but let's just my little 2 cents worth. In terms of Amilcar and precarious, yeah, you're asking what it means in practice, this unprecedented austerity. Now, let's answer what it means. So the forecast is 7% contraction of GDP. And this is 4 times worse than what happened under the global financial crisis. We could see the loss of millions of jobs. Now you add austerity on top of that. Treasury is forecasting a 2.6% recovery in 2021, and then 1.5% in 2022, and 1.5% in 2023. Now, if you're going to implement austerity of that scale that they're talking about, and there's many people who believe that they can't implement it, yeah, there's too much to cut, there'll be nothing left to cut, that it's going to prolong the recession, which may go on for 2 or 3 years. That is my view in terms of what's going to happen, to answer your question. So precariousness will increase in this economy. You will see widespread destitution in our society. And there will be no option but to implement a basic income grant to protect the most vulnerable in society. So we have to look at scenarios that happen. I think it's too ghastly to contemplate what is going to happen if the government gets to implement this level of austerity.
Okay, thank you, Duma. Thank you very much. Let me just find out if there are any hands, any comments. Oh, yes, I see Comrade Rob. Comrade Neil, I'm not sure whether this is now a new hand or this is still the old hand. But I see Comrade Rob, yeah. Comrade Rob.
No, thanks, Commissioner. I think that I want to also appreciate the contribution from Duma, and just to ask if we can, in addition to having this thing recorded, if we can have the slides put on a website, so we can get the slides as well, because I think there's a number of very useful points. I wanted to say that I think that the part of the clawback, I think, has already been mentioned, is now to mobilize technical work around alternatives. And I think that the economist says, I think that point has already been made. I wanted to kind of reinforce that one. I think it's very, very important that this begins to happen and that credible alternatives are put, including, I would suggest, in the parliamentary discussion that's taking place around this budget. I hope that that people have been applying to go and make presentations at this budget, because I think that in the abstract, I mean, I think this, I did actually read the Stephanie Kelton book, and also looked at quite a few YouTubes that she gave and others have given, including the interview with Yanis Varoufakis. And I think that there can be ways in which at a sort of abstract level, modern monetary theory won't be taken on board, holus bolus. People will come up with arguments that, it may apply in the United States. And I think she made one very telling point, that there's never a shortage of money when it comes to going to war, or when it comes to providing tax relief for the rich. There's never a shortage of money in the US. It's actually a decision that's taken by the society that it doesn't want to provide full employment, or it doesn't want to, provide decent healthcare. That's talking about the US. So I think that there could be arguments in the abstract that people will come along and say, well, we're not the US. We don't have the same power as the US, and even if it applied there, we are a small open economy, or whatever all the arguments would be. But if we can tie down, I think, a few serious proposals. I mean, Duma has pointed us in the first direction, but I also think that, for example, this debate, I wanted to make this point because I was around in some of that. My understanding about the pension funds, government employees' pension funds, was that at 1994, it wasn't pay as you go, but it wasn't fully funded either. There was a percentage of funding. And there was a debate at the time, and I remember I was partly involved in it as well, and went along to the alliance on behalf of the party at one stage. And we were arguing at that stage, why don't we reduce the percentage coverage and put the funding into the RDP at that time? And that was never taken on board. But then surreptitiously, we moved, I think during gear time, I don't think anybody really noticed, to this 100% coverage, which is what we've got today. And of course, the arguments are that, there's no way that all the people and all the potential liabilities for pensions from government are going to be realized in 1 year. You don't need 100% coverage. It can be invested. It can be released. This funding can be released. I think that's another area where we could push, as in addition to the I think the issue about prescribed assets and stimulus and quantitative easing. If you look at some of the stuff that's been said about, well, even what's happening now in the States, There's a piece, very interesting piece in New Left Review by Robert Brenner about what is the quantitative easing. Yeah, big sums of money, but where's it going? This time it doesn't seem to be going to bail out banks, it's bailing out large non-bank companies without any conditions or anything like that. So I think that the direction of spending is part of the argument, that we need to be arguing that we're spending on social infrastructure that's going to build us ability to withstand future pandemics, future crises. It's going to build economic infrastructure that's going to provide incomes. It's going to support local production, industrialization, bringing people into township economies on a higher level of production than at the moment. I think all of these things are going to be part of the arguments. In other words, where the money is going to go. And that might win a few battles, I think, in some of these fora. But I do think that that some sort of getting the people together to say, this is the kind of program that we need to cope with this crisis. This is where some of the resources could come from in a very concrete way. I think that might be something that that needs to be done, and I'm sure that Duma is infinitely well placed to play a very leading role in such a process. Thanks.
Thanks, Comrade Rob. There is Bongani Cooper again, just briefly, and then a new person who hasn't spoken is Comrade Reg. So Comrade Bongani briefly, and then Comrade Reg.
Thank you, Comrade Steele. Duma, I think for me, I saw the slide you showed on the informal sector. I think you are talking about employment in the formal and informal sector, and I think that there's quite a huge difference between the informal sector as a business and the formal sector as a business. I think here I'm referring specifically to the informal sector as a business, and secondly, also on the employment side. I mean, I happen to work quite closely with the tax industry. I mean, I'm in the tax industry. If you just look at the numbers from an employment point of view, if that sector can be formalized, I think in the next 3 to 5 years, we can be able to create between 3 and 5 million 3 and 5 million jobs within the economy. So I think for me, that's the first part. But the second part is that if you look at the level that you're talking to, for me, I quite support that level. But I think part of the major problem has been, how do you then take that to the level where it does have a real impact? I think Comrade Stay spoke about a household. How does this household feel part and parcel of this new opening economy, so in such a way that they can on their own be able to feel as part and parcel of this? So I think at that lower level, there is quite a lot of technical understanding and support in terms of how do you thoroughly improve. In fact, my experience with CIFA has been along those lines. We've gone to raise some money within CIFA, but some of the problems you encounter is that from just at that small level where you think an opportunity has opened, but it's impossible to turn it around because of the systems that are basically employed at that local level. So I think that match between thinking and implementation and the provision of those resources, it's important to contemplate, to look at, so that it can have a direct impact rather than a high level impact. Thank you.
Thank you, Bongani. But by the way, just to mention, comrades, that we have in line to have actually a session on the informal economy in a couple of weeks from now, but we will keep you informed as we go along. Comrade Reg?
Thanks, Comrade Stay. Mine is not a comment on Duma's work. I think excellent. Thanks very much, Duma. Quite a nice presentation. I was just wanting to respond to Comrade Rob in regard to MMT and perhaps its practical application to developing countries. I have been in the MMT circles for a number of years, as early as the 1990s, and I am also part of the MMT team, or grouping, if you want, that is communicating on a daily basis, located in London, and combines the entire European community as well as the US. So in regard to, in South Africa here, I actually look after the MMT issues. So I'm quite familiar on that front. I think if it is about using some of the ideas of MMT, frankly, we can. And the notion that MMT applies to advanced countries, it's quite frankly one of those rules, if you want, things that people talk about. It does apply virtually everywhere. But just as much as not all things that are done in the UK under a neoliberal system can be done in Uganda, for example. So it can't be that MMT cannot be applied to the developing world. It can. I think as part of a package of solutions, frankly, we do have ideas that can assist. But there's also this misunderstanding about MMT, Comrade Rob. MMT stands on the shoulders of John Maynard Keynes, and they're just post-Keynesians. And to classify them as if they're some peripheral, school is quite frankly nonsensical. They stand on the shoulders of all we stand on. So it's not correct. And I think for those who want to cheapen MMT is eventually just because they're ignorant. I just wanted to reflect on that, and that there is a practical way of using MMT views for solutions in the country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll give to Comrade Duma just to respond and make, I suppose, closing words. And so I have contact with Duma, so I am going to make sure that I will also ask him to send me and to send us both the presentation, even the article that he was citing from as well, all the kind of relevant material, and then we will place it on the CHI Facebook page. Comrade Duma.
Thank you very much. I want to thank all of you for spending time to listen to me and the debates that we're having. I just want to say that in terms of what Comrade Rob was saying, I think is correct. My presentation was to look at broad issues around mobilizing finance, but at some point people will want specifics in terms of what do we call, how will this prescribed assets issue? So we need to have technical papers on each of the elements, some of these elements that we can decide on. So you saw there was this well-coordinated COVID-19 economics groups, which was giving the mainstream view that gave rise to some of the current proposals in the mainstream. So I think we need to have some kind of alternative where we let different ideas bloom and out there, and we can unpack it into something that eventually is. So when you speak to the prescribed assets, for example, you can make it relevant to the man in the street and they can understand how they will benefit. For example, even Bongani's taxi people in terms of prescribed assets. And then in terms of how does it benefit the households, I've read the US Green New Deal, and the way it is presented, there's sort of a campaign run by Justice Democrats and Sunside, different groups. And when you read this thing, a minority of the idea is relating to pure green issues, but immediately you can see how it impacts on you. So if you're in Mpumalanga and you're moving from coal mining towards renewable energy, I'm using the Green New Deal framework, you will immediately see that my family will be covered if I lose my job. And there will be a basic income grant. There will be free medical care in the Green New Deal. There will be everything, the new jobs that are going to be created in the new industries it becomes very tangible in the way it's presented, that you can immediately, I read that thing within 10 minutes, I understood where the new jobs are going to be created. But in South Africa, for example, when you talk about the transition to green, it is a slogan that means nothing to the ordinary people because it doesn't have content. But if we put content and then in a way that the person in the taxi industry, the person in different industries will immediately say that, no, this is not something that I should fear. I'm going to benefit, my family's going to benefit, my daughter's going to benefit, and so forth. So I just think, yeah, it's partly presentation. It's also coming to technical details about various aspects about what we're talking about. But thank you very much for inviting me. I'll share with the presentation as well. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Comrade Duma. Just before we close,
last question I wanted to say, sorry.
Oh, yeah, yes, Duma.
One thing, we don't want to implement quantitative easing the way it was done in the rich countries. There are very strong critiques about how it was implemented in the rich countries, how the money became trapped in the financial sector, how it drove up asset prices, how it exacerbated inequality, and so forth. But we're talking about the principle. It can be used not in the way it was done in the rich countries, in the way it was done to build and to create. So we can explain how it can be done differently. So we're not saying we want to take the way it was done in rich countries and just do it in our countries. No, that's not what we're saying.
Thank you very much, Duma. Let me just give Alex just a few minutes. Yeah, Comrade Alex. You are muted, Comrade Alex.
No, I said today I had decided to be a learner, not even a student. I wish to thank Comrade Duma for the wonderful presentation he has made, and for all other comrades who participated and who are watching on both the Krisani Institute and the SACP Facebook pages for their time. What is very clear is that it is not correct to suggest that there are no alternatives, or to suggest that the alternatives that we put forward from the heterodox, and that include the Marxist school of thought, the critical political economy school, those alternatives are not working. I wish to thank the Krisani Institute for offering us this platform for the exchange of ideas. And it is very clear that at the end of the day, we will have to achieve a change through class struggle. But class struggle is guided by consensus building, which is what I see emerging from this session. I'm not sure whether you were going to announce this, and perhaps this could be of interest to Bongani. We have Comrade Pat Horn, who the Krisani Institute will host on the informal economy. She is one of the experts involved in that sector of the economy from a heterodox point of view, and it would be beneficial of you to attend that session and to also make a contribution. Otherwise, this has been a wonderful presentation. I have noted several points that, to repeat, could involve a risk of lowering quality. However, one thing needs to be underlined. We do need to protect our democratic national sovereignty. That in economic policy formulation involves at least two objectives. Firstly, we do need to protect our policy space. Secondly, we do need to build a truly sovereign monetary policy, because you do hear, I was attending the session yesterday hosted by Amandla, and you do hear from the government the argument that the Reserve Bank is functioning independently. That argument is not convincing if one follows the coordination or global coordination of macroeconomic policy and its impact on fiscal policy by institutions like the IMF. If you follow those institutions, you can tell which direction institutions like the Central Bank of South Africa will take or are following in their policy space. And I don't think that can be characterized as independence. We do not need a central bank that is independent from national democracy, but is being directed, whether ideologically, theoretically, whether by means of modeling, by things that are decided out of the country by other institutions. That is no independence at all. So that's one of the key things we do need to advance. And we do need to look at these figures of how much money is available in the economy. And I like quite the way Duma responded to the National Treasury's supplementary budget review on a key point without saying that he was responding to that point. In that supplementary budget review, the minister says that we cannot increase domestic borrowing because that will exhaust domestic resources for investment in the economy. And he uses that as a reason for going out of the country to look for foreign currency denominated debt, which I do not agree with. I agree with the presentation made by Duma on that question and the assertion he has made. So thank you very much, colleagues, and much appreciated.
Thank you, Comrade Alex. By the way, just as in closing, as an announcement, next week on Thursday, we have also a session with Comrade Aska Adezade, and he will be speaking on COVID-19 and the South African development outlook, South Africa's future growth outlook. And so it's going to be quite a useful and interesting session. Sorry, my light is off here. That's why I am now in the darkness. But that session will actually not have it at 4. We will having it at 5 because he is on the more western side of the US, and so he will be able to catch us. It will be almost 7, 8 o'clock for him in the morning, while for us it will already be 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And so on that note, comrades, thank you very much for this very interactive and interesting session. And as Comrade Alex just mentioned as well, we are going to continue having more. We have just secured as well. So a week after next week, which is Comrade Aska, then we will have Comrade Chris Malikane, and then followed him, then we will have Comrade Pat Horn, and then we will start almost a new series now looking more specifically on the industrial policy issues, in which we will have a few sessions even with that. And so we are really trying to create this space to really put this very protected voice to add alternative and essentially to enable to educate each other and essentially to present this alternative voice. Yes, and by the way, just before we close, some of you might have heard on the news of the said the very tragic thing in the Western Cape with the shooting of one of the the secretary or the branch secretary of the SACP branch in one of the branches in Western Cape. And so we to the comrades here that are members of the parties, that are leadership of the party, and to the family, we also pass our deep condolences. We are hoping that the law will be able to be quite swift around apprehending the people that are responsible for that. And so we'd like to thank the comrades, but we will send the notice for next week, and we wish you all a wonderful evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you, comrades. Sure.
Bye, comrades.
Thank you and good night, comrades.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
It's a leave.